I think we're in an interesting shakeout period as to which of these frameworks is it's getting complex and burdensome for our clients. Like, so we have a client, we're working with right now.
Hmm.
They're ISO 27001, they're SOC 2, and they're high trust, and they're looking at me and going like, "Do we really need all this?" I'm like, "No."
Welcome to Secure and Simple podcast. In this podcast, we demystify cybersecurity governance, compliance with various standards and regulations, and other topics that are of interest for consultants, CISOs, and other cybersecurity professionals. Hello, I'm Dejan Kosutic, the CEO at Advisera and the host of Secure and Simple podcast. Today, my guest is John Verry, and he's the managing director at CBIZ Pivot Point Security, a consulting company based in New Jersey, United States. And he has a huge experience, so more than 1,000 clients and 25 years in this business. So lots of things to talk about. And he's actually deeply engaged with various frameworks, including international standards like ISO 27001, ISO 22301, PCI DSS, but also US frameworks like CMMC, NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, HIPAA, and others. So, in today's podcast, you'll learn what kind of opportunities are out there with various cybersecurity frameworks. So, welcome to the show, John.
Thanks for having me on, Dejan.
You're welcome. And just to ask you first, so what do you prefer? I mean, out of these many frameworks, which ones do you prefer to work the most? I mean, as a consultant.
Good question. Historically, I'm an ISO 27001 fan. That's
Hmm.
that's originally how I became aware of you back early on. I'm going all the way back to
Okay.
2006. Right
Hmm.
after the standard had been published, we helped an org in New Jersey get ISO 27001 certified, and we were starting to put content out there. You were putting a lot of content out there. I read a lot of your content
Hmm.
over the years. You've contributed a lot. The reason I liked 27001 historically was the fact that it is a non-prescriptive framework, right? And it gives
Hmm.
you the flexibility of managing risk. It gives you the guidance on how to manage the risk, but it gives you the flexibility to manage that risk um, in manners which are most appropriate to your organization, right? So it provides a lot of flexibility.
Hmm.
It's great when you can use the same framework to protect very sensitive data like, let's say, troop movement, and very unsophisticated data like widget, the formula for a widget that a manufacturer makes.
Hmm.
So historically, I'm a huge ISO 27001 advocate for that reason. I have grown to appreciate some of the other frameworks a little bit, and
Hmm.
because none of them are perfect. I mean, where I love 27001 for that flexibility, inherently, someone can be 27001 certified, and kind of that flexibility gives them a little bit of wiggle room, and it might
Yeah.
not be
Yeah.
as mature or well executed a program as one that would be validated by a framework which would have more testing of the actual operational controls, the sort of the SOC 2,
Hmm.
sort of a CMMC, a high trust, something of that nature. So I've kind of grown to still ISO is my favorite. I love the extensibility, the
Hmm.
flexibility. I love the common management system across 27001, 27701, 22301, 9001 for our
Hmm.
manufacturing clients, now
Yeah.
42,001. So I'm still
Yep.
in that camp, but I'm a little bit more appreciative of some of the other frameworks as well.
Hmm. Yep. And yeah, I also see this with these European regulations like DORA and NIS2. Basically, 27001 gives a very good, I would say, baseline, and then you can build on it everything that these other standards, sorry, regulations actually require. And when speaking about these other frameworks that you mentioned, so what do you think? What kind of let's say add-on they have on top of 27001? So what do you like in these other frameworks that you mentioned?
So historically, I was not only not a fan of, I disliked high trust. Um, but
Hmm.
recently have been more exposed to it. I think some of the things that they do there with um, not only the extent and rigor of the audit and the depth to which they're validating the operational effectiveness of the controls is a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they also have kind of an interesting concept around uh, in order to be certified, you need to have a passing grade in each of the domains. So there's more of a recognition, if you will, that
Mm-hmm.
a recognition that a failure in a single domain can lead to a broader challenge to the overall effectiveness of the cybersecurity program. So that would be something like, as an example, in a different framework that I look at and go, you know what, that's kind of a clever and pretty good idea. Another
Mm-hmm.
interesting one is ISO 42001, and in
Mm-hmm.
42001, they introduced the concept of an impact assessment as opposed to just a risk assessment,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where risk assessment historically is the risk to us as an organization, and impact assessment is the risk to the users of said system and society as a whole. And it makes me think that that's really kind of a cool concept that we should use in ISO 27001 as well, right? Why should we be a
Mm-hmm.
provincialist? Like, well, yeah, our tool, it's not a big risk to us, but we could destroy the world. But let's not worry about that, right? And in ISO 27001, you don't need to. So that would be another example of like a place where I've seen something in another framework that I looked at and said, dang, that's a good idea. Like we should use that more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is there any similarity in this impact assessment for 42001 with the business impact analysis in 22301?
I'm not a super knowledgeable 22301 guy, but I don't think so, right? Because the system impact
Mm-hmm.
assessment, right? With AI, right, we have to be cognizant of the fact that um, if we are a producer or provider of AI, and our AI, let's say, exhibits bad behavior, whether it's, let's say
Mm-hmm.
bias, right? We have to be aware of
Mm-hmm.
what would be the impact on the subject of this, right? So if I'm producing an AI-enabled SaaS application that does employee screening, right, or resume
Mm-hmm.
screening, right? If my AI is biased, right, I could have a negative impact on a particular race or creed of people, right? And if
Mm-hmm.
you take this to an extreme, if I was developing artificial intelligence that was part of a weapons program, right? I mean, I could launch an attack that could destroy the world, right? So that's
Yeah.
impact assessment, right? Where our risk assessments historically are about risk to the company, risk to the entity itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean. I don't think 22301 has kind of done that yet, um, but I'm not a 22301.
No, it's I mean yeah, the this business impact analysis from 22301 is more focused on let's say particular activities or particular departments within the company and basically how the disruption actually impacts the business. So it's not really the same focus as in 42001. And going back to high trust, so where do you see the biggest market there? I mean, which companies are actually requiring their suppliers or anyone else to have high trust?
So historically, high trust, and it started, with, I think it was the healthcare. Healthcare was the age of high trust. It no longer
Hmm.
is. So what they've tried to do with high trust over the years is evolve it from being a healthcare specific framework to being a
Uh-huh.
more general cybersecurity framework. And they're integrating,
Hmm.
some well implemented within the single framework. It's flexible. It ranges from they have three different levels, right? E,
Okay.
I, and R2, right? And E starts at like 19 controls, sort of entry level, self-assess. 44 is first level, and I might be a little off because I'm not an expert in this. But 44, I
Hmm.
believe, is the second, the I one, and that is the one first level of third-party assessment. And then if you go to R2, which is the original historic, that is
Hmm.
hundreds to thousands, depending upon all of the different add-ins that you can add, like whether it's
Hmm.
privacy or artificial intelligence and things of that nature. So it's just a very it sort of is combining the best of ISO and the best of SOC 2, right? Because SOC 2
Uh-huh.
doesn't have
Uh-huh.
the governance, the management system to assess. So you got to
Hmm.
bang the hell out of the controls, we like to say, right? You do a lot more control testing, where ISO doesn't rely on control testing because we're relying on the management system and we put more effort into the assessment of that. Think of it
Mm-hmm.
as being HITRUST is kind of like is taking the validation of the management system because it does require a management system, and then
Mm-hmm.
it also beats the hell out of the control. So it's sort of the
Mm-hmm.
equivalent of a client having an ISO and a SOC on the same scope.
Uh-huh. 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 Okay, and I mean, SOC 2 is primarily, let's say, from the market point of view, interesting in United States. Is the same thing with the high trust, or is this more a worldwide standard?
I think it's predominantly at this point you see more of it in the U.S. We are seeing it occasionally with some of our
Mm-hmm.
international clients. It still does have, the clients that we have that are high trust tend to be in the healthcare space, right? Either from a historical
Uh-huh.
perspective or the United Health Groups and CIS, and WellPoint and Anthems tend to be the orgs that are still most frequently requesting it. But we're now starting to see
Mm-hmm.
it leak out into other areas. And I think it's going to be a viable competitor in the marketplace. I think we're in an interesting shakeout period as to which of these frameworks is it's getting complex and burdensome for our clients. Like, so we have a client, we're working with right now.
Mm-hmm.
They're ISO 27001, they're SOC 2, and they're high trust, and they're looking at me and going like, "Do we really need all this?" And I'm like, "No." Like, okay, what? And now you're going out and you're fighting with your customers to say, hey, I'll
Mm-hmm.
give you an ISO, or I'll give you a high trust. You don't need a SOC 2, right? So we're trying to subset down what they actually have. It gets even more complex now with if you're a healthcare provider and you're providing, let's say, healthcare services to the VA hospital system. Okay, well, now you've got
Mm-hmm.
controlled unclassified information, right? So now you're in the CMMC world as well. So you think about it like,
Yeah.
I got one client who wants 27,001. I got another one who wants SOC 2. I got another one who wants high trust. Got another one who wants CMMC. It's nearly impossible if you're a 100-person, 200-person SaaS provider, to be able to have the
Yeah. To
team and dollars to maintain that many certifications.
Yeah, yeah. And how is HIPAA related to high trust? Since both of them are actually basically focused on health providers. So what is the connection between them?
Well, HIPAA obviously is, the U.S. requirement, promulgated out of, the U.S. government, right?
Hmm.
HHS and CMS and OCR, et cetera, right? So that's a, hey,
Hmm.
if you're gonna process this, this is the legal requirement that you have, right? To do that. Where high trust is more an ISO equivalent, which is voluntary,
Hmm.
and it's a mechanism of providing assurance to a third party that the data in scope is being treated in accordance with the framework, the controls therein, based on the context of the organization.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, because I'm asking this because in most cases when it comes to ISO standards, companies go for ISO standards because they are required by their customer, so by their buyer. So when it comes to HIPAA and high trust, if the health providers are obliged to do this because of, I mean, if they must comply with the HIPAA, why would they then comply also with high trust? Is there some additional, let's say, push from the let's say supply chain or something to
Yeah,
do
it's
this?
it's exactly the same reason. It's an alternative to, increasingly, you're seeing, when you get your third party security assessment, the due diligence that's being done on you
Hmm.
as let's say a third party service provider. Are you ISO 27001 certified, SOC 2 attested, or high trust, right? And
Hmm.
it's you know
Hmm.
and it's pick one, or and yeah, and okay, that's gonna help you pass their security due diligence
Hmm.
and acquire them as a customer. So high trust is one
Okay.
of those ones that allows you to do that, right?
Hmm.
And
Okay.
say
It's
I would
interesting.
say, like, HIPAA, is more akin to PCI DSS and more akin to New York State DFS 500, right? These are, I look at ISO and as being a mechanism to address a contractual obligation, and then
Hmm.
part of contractual obligation and it is also achieving legal requirements, right? Meeting legal requirements, which is the
Hmm.
HIPAA or payment card is not that PCI is legal, but it's still an obligation, uh, uh,
Yeah,
in
for payment
into a
providers.
legal
Yeah.
obligation, right?
Hmm. Hmm. And when you compare, for example, a SOC 2 and 27001 and HITRUST in the US markets, which one is kind of the most popular? Which one? Because here in Europe, obviously 27001 is dominant when it comes to a standard, right? But in there is a SOC 2 in the US. So which one do you see actually is kind of having the biggest market share?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I'm actually the right person to ask that, only because we're known for ISO 27001, right? Like
Uh-huh.
if you do a search, you're going to find our content from Pivot Point Security, now CBIZ Pivot Point Security on the web, because they haven't migrated all the content over to the CBIZ website
Hmm.
yet. But like we're known for ISO, so the vast majority of our clients are ISO 27001. That being said, there's a lot of SOC 2 out there, right? And it's a widely accepted
Hmm.
within the US. There's a ton of SOC 2. So what I would say is that I think they're both they're both significant in the US. If I had to guess, I'd say there's probably more SOC 2 than ISO, and it makes sense because the companies that are going in like CBiz, right? Because we're now the seventh largest firm. We have a CPA. We're a CPA company as well.
Hmm.
Um, the companies that are coming in doing tax and finance and attest and providing guidance to leadership. On that side are saying, well, you should have a good cybersecurity program. And by the way, we can do SOC too, right? So I think historically that's how that stuff got in. Where we saw ISO 27001 begin to leak into the U.S. was more those companies that had clients that were either European based or they had European
Hmm.
operations. Then we saw certain industries begin to adopt ISO specifically. So despite the fact that there is a lot of SOC 2 in the legal vertical in the United States, right? ISO became sort of the de facto 27001 became the de facto standard there. It was promulgated
Hmm.
by there's an entity here called the International Legal Technology Association, ILTA, which is a really significant player in the for law firms, and their legal sec council or committee, I forget what they call it, suggested that ISO 27001 was a good framework for law firms to align with. So if you look at
Uh-huh.
the top 200 law firms in the world, the vast majority of them are ISO 27001 certified. I'm not sure that
Uh-huh.
I know of
Uh-huh.
any that are SOC 2.
Oh, interesting, yeah. And do you also work with clients that are in Europe, that are from
Mhm.
Europe?
Yeah, but I would say it's not I would say we are U.S. centric. Now we have,
Uh-huh.
very large car manufacturers, some plane manufacturers, like we
Hmm.
work outside of the U.S. Some really cool, technology companies, some really good SaaS companies. But I would say we tend to do, I'd say 80+% of our business is probably U.S. centric companies. Now, many of them
Uh-huh.
have overseas operations, but we do have clients that are, Denmark and Sweden and some.
Great, great. This is a great success. And do you see some, let's say, differences in when you work for an American client and when you work for a European client? Is there, let's say, a different way of how they work with consultants?
Um, it depends. I would say that we've had some experiences where it's, you know, I think it depends on the country. I think it depends on the culture. I think it depends on the language. Um, you know, we uh, there are different norms of business in different countries, right? I mean, historically, I think
Hmm.
people know, like, in Japan, the culture is a bit different, and and the way
Yeah,
that they entertain guests, same with France, right? In France, like
yeah,
I've done business in France and visited France on business trips, and you know, they feel an obligation in the evening to entertain you, right? Like, if
yeah.
every night they want to, they also, they also, it's more common that stretching the truth is sort of accepted business. It's sort of like the way you negotiate. Like, like I think most people expect that when you go into a negotiation, that someone might start a little higher than they want, someone might start a little low because you're going to meet in the middle. Like, like in different cultures, like in France, like stretching the truth on certain things is just sort of, it seems to be more the way that they, and we probably just lost all French customers. But anyway, it seems to be more like it, accepted there, right? It's like, it's, it's
Yeah.
part of the way that it's an expectation. So we see things like that
Hmm.
are a little bit different. The other challenge that I think is harder about working in other countries sometimes is language differences. If a customer really would prefer that their documentation is aligned with their native language, that can be a little bit challenging, can be a little bit difficult. Some of the human resource laws, regulations like that we're comfortable with know very
Hmm.
well here in the U.S. are different in overseas markets, and you have to be cognizant of that.
Hmm. Yeah. Because I'm asking you all of these things because of course, more and more of consulting work is done remotely, right? And very often European consultants are thinking about penetrating the U.S. market, and I assume also U.S. Consultants are thinking the same about European market. And I'm wondering, is this really realistic that you actually start selling your services overseas? I mean, over the Atlantic? Is this something that can really be done, or is this only kind of something that happens every now and then?
At least well, so first off, anyone who is a European consultant, stay out of the U.S. It's horrible here. You don't want to. I'm joking, John. I don't want them to compete with us. Um, but that's a really good question. I think in general, um, if you gave, and it's weird, right? Because it shouldn't theoretically matter much if I'm virtual. If I'm virtual in New
Hmm.
Jersey and you're in England, or I'm virtual in England and you're in England. But I have found that I think most organizations would prefer to work with somebody who's local. So I
Hmm.
would say that in general, when we compete with an organization that is local, to in a country over, in Europe somewhere. I think that if
Hmm.
all things being equal, price, competency, that they would favor the local entity. It's just a higher comfort level. I would say we win when we work and we win projects overseas. I think it's generally because we have a unique characteristic specific to that type of engagement, right? So it might be that we've done work with many of the largest law firms in the world, and let's say one looks at us and
Hmm.
said, "Well, I know you did them, and I know you did them, and they're our peers. We know you got them certified. You'll be able to get us certified. We're going to pick you." We just did a big project overseas where the client wanted to be ISO 27001 certified, but they also wanted to be CMMC attested, right? So you are
Hmm.
in the defense industrial based supply chain to the U.S. CMMC comes into play. So they want to, and we have expertise in CMMC and ISO, and it would be unlikely that a European consultant would have that combination of expertise. So that would be an example of, so I would say if you're listening to this and you're a consultant and you're in Europe and you want to work in America, look for those opportunities where, so as an example, I think you'd have a natural advantage, right? If a client was struggling with GDPR, if a client was struggling with the
Yeah.
EU AI Act, if a client was struggling with DORA,
Hmm.
right? Because I think inherently, because you spend a lot of your time dealing with those three frameworks, and we spend less time in the U.S. dealing with those frameworks, I
Hmm.
think that you are going to have a competitive advantage. And I think if you can promote that competitive advantage, you'd have an opportunity to win more work here in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely, I mean, if you have a very distinct competitive advantage, if you have some distinctive know-how or skills, then you may actually penetrate these markets. Otherwise, it's really difficult.
I would agree. The other
It's
thing
really
too is,
hard.
you be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. It's not easy working overseas, right? When we do, you're working, 6 or 8 hours difference. There's time
Hmm.
zone differences, like you said, there's culture differences and things that you need to get used to. Those
Hmm.
would be some of the other, I think, challenges of doing that.
Yeah. You mentioned GDPR. So obviously in Europe, this privacy law is centralized, right, for all the countries. I mean, in the European Union, whereas in the US, I noticed that basically every state is publishing their own privacy law. So how do companies actually? I mean, companies that operate on a nationwide in the United States, how do they manage this multitude of privacy laws?
Badly. To be honest with you, it's a nightmare. Like, so,
Yeah.
So first off, we have not in the U.S. advanced nearly as far as you guys have with privacy, right? So a lot of these laws that come
Hmm.
out, many of them are not yet fully in effect. Even in places where they're fully in effect, I think a lot of American companies have not yet gotten to a point. They're putting privacy programs in place, but they're not putting truly compliant privacy programs in place. And I feel bad for
Hmm.
it. Like we have a client that we're a client we work with very closely, handle a lot of private information, PI, and I think they have 79 different regulations that they're trying to comply with.
Wow.
It's 15 or 20 U.S. frameworks and then the overseas ones. So it's a nightmare for
Hmm.
everyone because even a European company, right? If you're doing business in Brazil, if you're doing business there are literally many dozens, probably more than 100 privacy regulations around the world in countries as
Yeah.
well. So they've got to do something about
Hmm.
this. Now, the good news is that GDPR, for better or for worse, is exceedingly comprehensive and laid a framework, a foundation that I think everyone else is built on. So the good news is
Yeah.
that they're all built around the same core principles. It's just the subtleties of this one does require this or doesn't, or the reporting period is this, or the terminology that they use is ROPA versus data map. It's just if they could just, I mean, it would be great if there was just one framework.
Yeah.
In the US, by the way,
And I mean,
they're pushing
by the
for it. The
way,
big guys like the Googles, Microsofts, they've gone to the federal government and they're pushing for a single privacy regulation just because they don't want to have to
hmm
deal with the 20. And then I think in the big beautiful act, this Donald Trump thing, the law that just passed, he actually
hmm
is trying to block state regulations around AI because we have the same problem happening in AI, right? You got New York City
uh-huh.
Bias Act and you got the Colorado AI law. So the states are starting to regulate AI within their states independently, which is going to create the
hmm
same kind of challenge, right?
Yeah.
So,
And by the way, ISO 27701 can also help kind of handle various various privacy regulations and basically
and by the
have
way,
them
the
integrated.
client that I was
And
referring to is ISO 27001, ISO 27701, and ISO 42000 because
hmm
they do it as well.
hmm
So I agree with you.
and
27701 helps, but it's
mhm.
still exceedingly difficult.
Yeah. And in the US, is this, let's say, business of helping these companies with regulations, is this mainly on consultants or is this mainly on law offices? So who is actually, who are the major players for helping companies out with privacy?
Good question. I think it's a combination thereof, right? Because I think even with AI, especially if you look at the EU AI Act, right? There's a
Hmm.
there's a legalese component to it, and there's definitely a legal
Uh-huh.
component to privacy. But you
Hmm.
can't have privacy without cybersecurity, good cybersecurity program, right? So, realistically, I think in a perfectly architected solution, you've got a JD, a lawyer, that is interpreting what needs to happen, defining that, and then providing those requirements downstream to the cybersecurity team, which is responsible for ensuring that the implementation of the controls is capable of meeting that, right? So, like, if you don't have a good data governance
Hmm.
program in place, right, you're not going to be able to comply. If you don't, right?
Yeah.
So I think that IT, of course, is going to be responsible for ensuring that you can service a data subject access request. So I think that it's a combination thereof.
Hmm. Okay. Uh, no, you mentioned AI several times. So, do you see, or better to ask you, how much do you see of AI as an opportunity for consultants?
I think it's massive.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, uh, think of it this way: every SaaS application, right? SaaS applications are now what, 50% AI enabled, 60% AI enabled. Going towards probably 80 or 90% AI enabled. I was working with an attorney recently, and I was talking about the fact that they really need an AI risk management program, and he kind of was dismissive of it. And
Hmm.
he happened to be a big M&A guy, and I said, okay. He goes, because we're not using. I said, you're using it every day. You just don't realize it. I said, I said, do you use Grammarly? He goes, oh yeah. I said, you spell check all the M&A documents that you do? Oh, absolutely, of course. I said, have you ever looked at your Grammarly? I said, let's log into Grammarly. Let's log in. We log into Grammarly, and it says in Grammarly's use, what do they call it? Licensing. It says we will
Hmm.
use your data to train our models unless you tell us not to. No, let's see if you told it not to. No, that button is not checked. I said, so just so you know, every document that you've proofed in the last N period of time is, that data is now sitting in their environment. And it's not likely with Grammarly, but with other applications, that data might have came back as a response in the Gen AI app, right? So
Hmm.
so I think the opportunity is massive because every client that's got ISO 20, every SaaS client that has ISO 27001, you know, they have it because clients ask them about their cybersecurity program. We're telling every client, you need to build an AI inventory, you need to know about these use cases, and you need to ensure that the third parties that are providing this AI to you are
Hmm.
meet the requirements of AI, right? Secure, transparent, repeatable, explainable, all the wonderful things that we want, resilient, secure, all the wonderful things that we want. So I think you've got that side of it. Then the other side of it that you've got is you've got the idea that these organizations, if you go into even a mid-market firm, mid-market firms got what, probably 200 AI-enabled applications, excuse me, SaaS applications
Hmm.
in use. Let's say that 120 of those are AI-enabled. Like, okay, you got to build
Hmm.
a AI acceptable use. You got to build an AI intake program. You got to update third-party risk management programs to address this. I mean, like, yeah, this is going to be, if you're not, yeah, if you're a consultant and you're not becoming knowledgeable on ISO 42001, the NIST AI risk management framework, and the EU AI Act, yeah, you're hurting your opportunities to be useful to your clients.
Yeah. Hmm. And so, what is kind of the relationship between 42001 and NIST AI risk management framework? So, is there a big overlap, or the?
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
they're when we like, if someone comes in and asks us to, let's say, do uh, an AI risk management review, right? A gap assess, if
Mhm.
you will. We'll do it against one, the other, or a combination thereof. And the combination thereof is, there's a significant level of overlap.
Mhm. So, are you saying that there is also an overlap between AI governance and cybersecurity governance?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, AI is a component of of cyber and vice versa, right? I mean, it's sort of like Venn diagrams, I guess you would look at it as.
Hmm.
Because if it's sort of like saying IT. I mean, AI is almost becoming like an underlying utility, like IT has become an underlying utility, right? We no longer think of it
Hmm.
as being independent of it, but
Yeah.
but yeah, and another thing people kind of get lost of is, especially if you're doing AI development, or you're a provider or producer of AI, it's effectively an application, right? So it's application security still is, a core component of it, right? Ensuring that the systems, the clouds, the servers, whatever it's running on, right, are secured as well. Ensuring that you've got user access management, good user access management, ensuring that you've got good logging and validation, that you're metricing the application. All of that stuff is really it's just one more element of cybersecurity that needs to be managed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
27001.
Yeah, I see lots of cybersecurity consultants that are actually adding AI governance as part of their offering. Some of them are even thinking about switching completely to AI because they see also a great opportunity there. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very good thing. Which actually, I wanted to ask you: do you think that cybersecurity consultants are the best positioned to actually move towards AI consulting, or it doesn't really matter? I mean, this cybersecurity background wouldn't matter there.
Um, it's a great question. Um, I would say people who have a cyber IT, when you look at what AI really is,
Hmm.
and we look at the underlying, there's a core. I mean, understanding machine learning, understanding programming, understanding data normalization. A lot of these are understanding application development, right? So I think coming from that technical discipline, and then of course cyber sitting on top of that, I think puts you in an advantageous position versus someone that wouldn't come with that. I do think that you could also make the same argument like we did with privacy, right? That coming from a legal
Hmm.
perspective, like if you're a JD, a lawyer, that there are probably things you bring to the table. Like, the EU AI Act is a challenge if you're not a lawyer to kind of interpret and figure out. So I do think that those are probably the two most advantaged skill sets to moving into AI governance and AI risk management.
Hmm. Great. Okay, so let's wrap up the discussion today with last question. So, what would you be your, let's say, suggestions to consultants that are in the cybersecurity and AI space? So, what do you think they should do or focus on?
Um, the one thing which I think just in general that when we hire someone new, I always kind of try to is we're not here to implement cybersecurity. We're here to help a business, right? So, and you can't
Hmm.
help a business until you really understand the business, right? Because you want to make sure that your recommendations are properly, I'm going to use the term contextualized. And it's funny I use the term contextualized because what's clause for is context. And to me, if you don't really understand the business, if you don't understand the types of data that they process, if you don't understand their business objectives, or you don't understand what laws and regulations apply to the data, what client contractual obligations they have, what cyber liability insurance obligations they have, where the business is right now, where the business needs to be in 2 years, where the cyber privacy and AI programs need to be to enable them to get there. I don't think you can be very good at it, right? Inherent to that, of course, is understanding the risks to the business. Risk from a technical perspective, but I think you need to also understand that the biggest risks to a business are often business risk, right? Failure to comply with the law
Hmm.
regulation, failure to achieve a client contractual obligation, failure to get, time to market, failure to get time to market, right? So you might have to compromise on a control in order to get to the market in a timely basis, right? You might have to, like for a minimum viable product, the security features might not be all the way there, but you've got to be willing to accept that. And one of the cool things about ISO, and one of the reasons I go back to ISO as being still my favorite, right, is
Hmm.
within ISO I can rationalize that to an auditor, right? Auditor could say, hey, you
Yeah.
should have this, and you're going to say, yes, we're going to do that, but the business has accepted this risk because of this unique business constraint. So I think that's an important part of that as well. And then, part of that, and it kind of speaks to the same thing, is think about security as not only value preservation, right, but value creation. Increasingly, that's the
Mm.
conversations that I'm having with our clients is not only how do I help you manage this risk right now, but how do I help you create value in the business, right? And that's that
Hmm.
strategic component. Where do you need to be? What is the business trying to accomplish? What markets are you trying to penetrate? What are going to be the expectations of those markets? And I need to know that a year, 18 months, 2 years before you need to get there in order to be able to get you there, right?
Great. So these are really great insights, and it's been thank you, John, and it's been a pleasure talking
It's
to
been a
you.
pleasure talking to you as well, and I'll throw a plug in here. Dejan was kind enough to come on the Virtual CISO podcast, because he knows a lot more than I do about NIS2 and DORA, so I asked him to come on and chat about it. So you guys should listen to that. Dejan's a very, very smart gentleman, and I appreciate his. So the fact that I was able to return the favor is no problem at all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Actually, I forgot to mention during the interview that you're a host also of this podcast, very popular podcast. It's already 200 or more episodes, right?
It's approaching that. Yeah, it's crazy how fast that goes. How many do you have under your belt?
Oh, not so much. It's like 15 or so. So it's still, I would say, a rather new things here. Okay. Anyway, thanks again, and thank you everyone for listening or watching this podcast. And see you again in 2 weeks' time in our new episode of Secure and Simple podcast. Thanks for making it this far in today's episode of Secure and Simple podcast. Here's some useful info for consultants and other professionals who do cybersecurity governance and compliance for a living. On Advisera website, you can check out various tools that can help your business. For example, Conformio software enables you to streamline and scale ISO 27001 implementation and maintenance for your clients. White label documentation toolkits for NIS2, DORA, ISO 27001 and other ISO standards enable you to create all the required documents for your clients. Accredited lead auditor and lead implementer courses for various standards and frameworks enable you to show your expertise to potential clients. And a learning management system called Company Training Academy with numerous videos for NIS2, DORA, ISO 27001 and other frameworks enable you to organize training and awareness programs for your clients' workforce. Check out the links in the description below for more information. If you like this podcast, please give it a thumbs up. It helps us with better ranking, and I would also appreciate if you share it with your colleagues. That's it for today. Stay safe.